Hello everybody and welcome back to another video. So for today's video, we're going to go ahead and answer another one of you guys' questions and hopefully we get you guys some good answers. If this is something you guys would like to see more of, feel free to leave down in the comment section down below any questions you guys might have that you're currently facing issues with or anything about this video in particular. And if you guys like this type of stuff, consider subscribing. I would greatly appreciate it. So with that said, let's jump into it. So in my Salesforce Apex REST Web Services serialized, deserialized JSON with Apex wrapper class post request video, I got this question down right here. This person said, "Hi Chris, can you also post a video on making a call out and sending a post request? For example, how do you pass parameters to a JSON string and send it to an external system in Apex?" And sure, yeah, I think we can make this happen. So I will be honest, I kind of did cheat a little bit and I did some of the background work just so you guys won't have to watch me, write the solution for the next half an hour. Hopefully this makes it a little bit faster, but let's jump into it. So I'm going to open up my code editors and we'll also open up our notes real quick just to kind of go over what's going to be done right now. So you want to see how a post callout is done in Apex. What I'm going to go ahead and do is kind of build up a scenario around that just to kind of give a more complete picture of, of how you might end up using this in work. Here in my notes, I have a scenario, which I just kind of made up on the spot. And let's pretend that you're at work and you got a request. And the request is to send supply data to an external service when the status of that supply record is changed to active. And here are the fields that they want us to send. And these are the JSON values that they're expecting. And so then that leaves us a question, we have to have an external service. Obviously, I don't really have any endpoints online. So what I kind of did is I went ahead and created a very simple project, just a simple npm install to get our package JSON. And if we look into it, I installed this thing called JSON server and ngrok. We don't really have to care too much about the specifics of this since this is not Salesforce specific. I'm essentially just using these tools, these npm packages, to spin up a fake JSON server that can accept some kind of data from an external endpoint, essentially saying we have this db.json file right here, and whenever we make a call out to this quote-unquote database, it should basically populate our supplies for us, just to give us an easy way of testing our code and having some endpoint to send data to. Again, don't really concern yourself too much with the specifics. It doesn't matter. The point of the video is still to do a post call out request. So with that said, I'm going to very quickly go to my terminal and just kind of spin everything up. So I'm just going to run my npm run scripts. This one is spinning up the fake JSON server database. And this one is going to be used to set up the ngrok, which is basically just a way to be able to call this JSON server database that's on my local computer online or through the internet. So you'll see here that we get this little URL. With this, I can make calls to my server that's on my computer. So again, don't really concern yourself too much. It doesn't really matter. Point is, now we have an endpoint that we can post the data to, and that's all that really matters. Okay, so with that said, we now have this endpoint, which is going to be very important in a few minutes. Let's go ahead and jump into our code that we are going to be concerned with. Now, like how I said, I already did some of the legwork so that we're not just sitting here watching me write code for half an hour or so. Like I said in my notes right here, we're going to send supply data to external service when the status is changed to active. And this specific scenario, it kind of sounds like a trigger might be useful. And that's kind of exactly what I've gone ahead and did. I created a trigger on the supply object, just called supply trigger. Right now, we're only using the before update. And very simply, I just kind of have a switch to kind of handle the different operation types. Right now, we're only going to be working with before update. In the before update trigger, we're calling this supply trigger handler .before update method. In the supply trigger handler class, and that before update method, it's calling this supply callouts.supply send supply to JSON server. We're sending in the old supply map and the new supply list. And just if you're not aware, the old supply map contains the old version of the records, and then the list contains the modified instance of those records, just so you can kind of compare what changed. And before we jump into the supply callouts, let's go into our JSON, a supply JSON wrapper. And a lot of this, actually, I think pretty much all of this code is exactly the same from the video in which you asked the question or the person asked the question. So I didn't really change anything. For the most part, I think we're going to be working with this global class supply class right here that contains our JSON representation of our supply record. So that's pretty much what we're going to use right here. So jumping into our supply callouts class, like I said in our notes, we're only going to send supplies that have met that specific criteria of going from some status to active. And I know a lot of this is not really relevant to this post callout that the person asked for. But like I said, I kind of want to frame a scenario in which this might kind of be useful for, more people that might be watching this video in the future. So hopefully I meet that vision, I guess. Anyways, so let's get started. In our send supply to JSON server method, what we want to do first is I'm going to go ahead and create a list at the very top. And this list specifically, it's going to be used to hold those active supplies or supply records. And you'll see in a minute what I mean by that. So let's go ahead and define this right here. And then right off the bat, we're going to do a for loop. So we're going to iterate through that new supply list that we got. We'll just call this instance new supply. We're going to iterate through the new supply list. And in here is kind of where we're going to do our check. So I will say if something, so basically we'll make some way right now of verifying whether that new supply status changed to active. So if something, then we're going to go ahead and add that new supply to the active supply list. So we'll do an add, and we'll just add the new supply right here. And I guess we can even go as far as to just change that new supply field. I think I had this field called animals payload. It's not really relevant. Basically what I'm doing here is just having some easy way of seeing whether or not we quote unquote queued up a record to be sent to my external service. So we'll say inside right here that is exactly that. So queued for transfer to JSON server. And we can even give it a timestamp. So I'll do like date time. And I think we'll just do like now. That should be fine. Okay. So we'll leave it like that. And at the end, we can say if that active supply list is not empty. So let's put in this exclamation point in the beginning. So basically it negates the is empty. So if it's not empty, then we'll go ahead and this will be like the post callout, which we'll kind of handle in a bit. For now, I want to handle this right here, the actual determining if it's actually active. So let's go ahead and create a private static. This will return a Boolean, and we'll call this is supply active. And again, I like to kind of separate some of my logic into separate methods, just to not make one method too big. It's kind of arbitrary sometimes the way you decide it, but right here I'm deciding that instead of putting it all in here, I'm going to separate it into its own method, just kind of keep things clean. Because now what I can do is right here, I can say, is supply active, right? Without writing that code itself. So this supply is supply active method. We're going to send it two things. So we'll give it the old instance of that record. So we'll go to the old supply map, and we're going to get that current record that we're iterating through, just using the new supply ID. And then we'll also send in that new supply as well. And here we're going to receive two records. Again, the old supply and the new supply, like that. And in here, it's going to be a very simple thing. I usually like to code like this, where I'll have some type of flag at the top. So I'll say, like this is a Boolean. It'll start with false, and we'll make sure we get it returned. And in the middle right here, we have an if statement that, if the criteria is met, then it will change that flag to true. Just a neat little programming trick I learned from a developer a long time ago. So in here is where we actually do our checking of our status. And all we have to do is just check the old status. So we'll say if this does not equal the new supply status, and the new supply status is, I believe we said active, or actually double equals, my bad, is active, like so. Now we could have used like a string method, like, is equals or is equals ignore case or something like that, but we're not going to concern ourselves too much with this. But anyways, if this criteria is met, the flag is switched to true, and then we just return that true, that flag, whatever it is. So, now at the top right here, we have this done. So, if we're going to iterate through all those records we got, and if the supply is active, we'll just add that to our active supply list. And we'll also make sure we change that animals payload field. Again, don't worry too much that it says animals payload. This is just a field I kind of picked out of random to just give ourselves some indication that, things did happen through our callout code. So once we have that, let's go ahead and start working on the actual, I guess, like the supply JSON code. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is in here, the way it works is, we expect to have that JSON as a string at some point. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is, let me give some space real quick. So we'll say string, and we'll call this, just call it like supply payload. It's no big deal what the name is. And this is going to come from some method. I'm just kind of naming it at the top of my head. It's just called generate supply JSON. And what we're going to pass into this method, it's going to be that active supply list. So yeah, we'll have this payload right here that's going to be generated from this method that we've yet to define. And, once we have this, we can pass it down to another method that I still have not defined. In this case, I guess we can just call it post callout. I'm not sure what to name it. And in here, we'll just pass in that supply payload like that. Okay, that looks fine to me. We can now go ahead and start defining these methods. And as you might have noticed right here, the way we're kind of coding this is kind of bulkified, right? We're assuming that this endpoint can receive multiple records at once. Sometimes it's the case that, you're working with old external endpoints for whatever reason. So you're working with some very outdated system that's only able to accept one record at a time. You would have to change this right here. But we're going with the assumption that this endpoint can receive multiple supply records at once in one giant payload. Anyways, so now let's go ahead and define our generate supply JSON method. So another private method, and I'm making these private because I don't expect these to be called outside of this supply callouts class. So it is called private static, and it's going to return a string, and it's called generate supply JSON. And in here, we are going to get or expect to receive a list of supplies, and we can just call this supply list. Doesn't really matter. Okay. So to start off, what I'm going to do is we're going to create a list, and this time we're going to make a list of supply JSON wrapper, and what we're going to be using is that supply class. So again, kind of going back to our supply JSON wrapper, we're essentially saying we're going to make a list of these types of objects. Once we instantiate the class, they become objects. So yeah, we want a list of these types of objects that come from this class. Essentially what we're doing right here. So a list of supply JSON wrapper.supplies or supply. And let's give this a name of supply JSON wrapper list, I guess. And we're just instantiating it for the first time. And let me go ahead and just kind of copy this because I'm too lazy. So supply, like so. All right. And next thing, what we want to do is we want to iterate through this list that we just received. So again, we're going to iterate through the supply list. We'll just call this supply. Iterate through supply list. And in here, let's see. I think instead of having the actual creation of, an instance of this in here, we can go ahead and create another method. And I know this is kind of expanding a little bit, but just to kind of keep, things a bit tidy and not too crazy, we'll create another method. This one will return an instance of supply JSON wrapper.supply. And we'll call this generate supply JSON wrapper. And this one will receive just a single supply. And we'll call it like that. And in here at the top, let's create an instance of that supply JSON wrapper.supply. And we'll just call this supply JSON. Create the new instance. Supply JSON wrapper.supply. Like that. Once we have an instance of that class, we can kind of go ahead and just start actually filling out those fields. So we'll say supply JSON, and then again, the name is going to be equal to whatever we got from that record. So supply, the actual supply record name. And then we will do record ID as well, which is just ID. And I'm going to go ahead and just copy the race because I don't really feel like writing the rest out. So here are the rest. It is quantity, status, and unit cost. And you might see here that we're typecasting this supply quantity to an integer. I think that's because in our supply JSON wrapper, we had defined it as a decimal, or sorry, yeah, as an integer right here. But the actual field is a decimal in our object. Doesn't really matter. Just something that I did right there real quick. Once we have all of that, we can just return our supply in JSON itself right there. So with that, we can kind of go ahead and in here in our for loop now, instead of writing all that mess of code, in our for loop, all we can say is call that method. So generate supply JSON wrapper like that, and then just pass in the supply. And this is going to return something, right? It's going to return basically an instance of this, to which I can create a variable to hold that. But since I'm kind of lazy, I'm going to go ahead and use this list right here, and we'll do an add. So just kind of add it directly like that. Hopefully that makes sense. Instead of doing something like this where we basically copy this right here, and then we say that this equals generate supply JSON wrapper, and then we add this in here. It seems like too much work for me, so I'm going to just keep it like this, keep it simple. And then once we're done, we can go ahead and return that entire supply JSON wrapper list like so. Or actually, no, we cannot do that. So this is expecting to receive or to return a string, right? Right now, if we were to try to return this, we will be returning this list of supply JSON wrapper.supply. So what we need to do is, instead of just returning it like that, we're going to make use of the JSON serialize method. And I like to use serialize pretty. We can go over the docs in a bit about why I like to do that. So we'll do here. And then this method can expect to receive 1 or 2 params or arguments, whatever they're called. And I'm going to set this one to false, and we'll just hit save on this. And let's jump into the documentation real quick to see why I'm using this. So I'm in the Salesforce Apex reference guide documentation, whatever you want to call it. And you'll see here that we have a few serialize methods. So here's a serialize object to serialize. All it says is just serializes the Apex object into JSON content. And then here's the same one, but there's this second right here called suppress Apex object nulls. The one that we were using is right here. So if you click on this, I don't really think there's much to it, but you'll see here, the first one is that list of supply JSON wrapper supply list. And the second was a Boolean that we passed in. And basically by setting it to false, we're not suppressing the null values. Now this could be important or not, depending on your external service. I'm just saying that, for example, if we go back into our code, basically what I'm saying is, let's pretend that this field on the supply record was null. By setting this flag to false, we're saying, don't remove it from the payload. Just keep it in there. We don't want you to remove it. So, in our JSON, we'll see unit cost equals null or blank or whatever it is. Just something very small, but something that might be important depending on your use case. Anyways, moving on. So once we have that, the generate supply JSON, we can go ahead and actually start working on our post callout method now. So let me go ahead and close these up just to make it not look as bad. So now we are going to do private static void. And we said we called this the post callout method, and it expects to receive a string. And we're just going to call it supply payload like that. And just so you know, we're going to be doing a callout, right? But since this code is called from a trigger, you can't just do a callout from a trigger. You have to annotate it with, or you have to basically do it asynchronously. And for the purposes of this video, we're just going to do a simple future call. But if you wanted to, you could do some type of other thing like a queuable or a batch, or it's up to you, right? Just to keep things simple, we'll just do a future method, and we'll say this is a callout equals true because we're going to be doing a callout on it. So in here, we are going to have an instance of HTTP like so. So let's create that instance like that. And then let's also create an instance of HTTP request. And we'll just kind of call this request, new HTTP request. And then right here is where we can kind of set our variables or properties of the request instance right here. And because I am lazy, I will go ahead and copy from an earlier demo that I did. So we're going to set the endpoint, set the method, set the header, and then set the body. The body is that JSON payload that we worked throughout all these methods to create. The content type, it's set to application /JSON because it's a JSON. We're doing post, And then in here, this is the URL. I have to change it out for the one that we recently created, which is right here. So I'm going to paste it right here, and then it's going to be /supplies because that is the endpoint that ngrok module created for us. Again, don't worry too much about ngrok or the JSON server. I guess it's kind of a good time to point out, if you guys are interested in seeing non-Salesforce developer related stuff like Python or Node or JavaScript or React, yeah, I think that's pretty much it. If you guys want to see that type of stuff, let me know and I can make videos on that. I know a bit about that as well. So anyways, yeah, once we have all these properties set up on a request instance object right here, let's go ahead and create an instance of the HTTP response. And we'll just kind of call this response right here, http.send, like so. And we're going to pass in the request that we've built up to this point. Now, again, I'm not really doing like any exception handling, which you might want to do if, this request fails or something, or, ways of handling request failures or payloads not being created properly. That is something that you might want to do. I think we'll kind of gloss over at the end because this video is already getting really long, but we'll do something simple. So we'll just say if, the response, we're going to get the status code. So we'll say status code. If it is like 200 or something, then we'll just do a simple debug to the system just to see, just to get some confirmation that, that it did work. And we don't really need this because we can check our endpoint to see that the data did post. But anyways, I'll just say supply post callout success. And I guess this is kind of like the point right here where I'm going to add a to-do, right? So right here, you can say like, at this point, if it was successful and we receive some payload back from the endpoint, you might want to consider like updating like some field on the supply records to indicate, that the payload, that the post request was successful or something. I don't know. It's up to you. Just a fair warning. If you were to do this in the future callout, you would have to, do a SOQL query to retrieve those records and then, post and then do some DML operation to update those records. I think I've done a video on this in the past. Also, you can use a queuable instead, but just some ideas, right? I don't want to make this video much longer than it is now. But with this, I think we're in a good spot to do some testing. So actually, before we do that, let's kind of walk through it one more time, right? Just to make sense. So starting from the beginning, we created a trigger on our supply object. Right now, we're only firing on before update. On before update, we're calling the before update method on the handler class. The only thing right now that's in it right now is just that send supply to JSON server method. It expects to receive the old supply map and the new supply list. Inside that actual method, it's right here. All we're doing is we're iterating through that list of supply records we received, and we're determining, if it actually is active. And the way we did that is by creating a method. And here is the criteria. Essentially, if the status changed from anything to active, we denote that it's an active record and we add it to our active supply list. Once we've built up that active supply list, we're going to pass it through our generate supply JSON method, which is down here. And basically what this method is doing, it's creating an instance of our supply JSON wrapper class, this inner supply class right here. And we're creating a list of that. Once we have that instance, we're going to iterate through those supplies that we deemed were active. And we're going to generate a supply object for each one of those. Once we have that list built up, then we basically just serialize the entire list and we return that back, right? The way we built up that's inner supply class or instance or object is right here, right? We created an instance of that supply inner class, which gave us this supply JSON object. And then basically we went ahead and just populated each field that we cared about, or each property or each variable that we cared about. And then we just returned it back up here, to which we added it to that supply list, supply JSON wrapper list right here. And then, like I said before, we just serialized the whole thing. And then I think I already explained why I use serialize pretty with the false flag. That was more so just to show you guys the different options that are available, as well as the documentation. So once we have all of that in here, we're able to do our post callout. The post callout, it is a future method with the callout equals true. We went over how to create basically just creating the HTTP and the request, and then setting those properties up, or how to set those properties up. And then I think we even went over, or we haven't yet, but how to do some type of exception handling and things like that. I think I'll create a video in the future going more in depth in that, because this video is already like 30 minutes long pre-production. So yeah, I think this is a good starting base for now, right? Okay, with that all out of the way, we'll hit save, and then let's try to deploy this source to org. Hopefully we don't have any errors. So it looks like we're good to go. And again, I will create a GitHub, is it called Gist or Gist? One of those two, with all this code right here, so you can guys just kind of copy paste as you need to. But hopefully you understand my logic behind it, and hopefully the code quality isn't bad enough. Again, as I always like to point out, none of this code is production grade code. This is just kind of like, you know, a demo that I'm using to explain to you guys. Obviously, you know, code review it, peer review it, whatever you want to call it. Make sure it's up to the standards of your company. This is just for demonstration purposes only. Okay, with all of that out of the way, now that we have this right here, let's go back into our Salesforce instance. I have this supply called toilet paper. Let me go ahead and refresh it real quick. So we see here, right now it's in status of draft. So I'm going to go ahead and let's change this quantity to like 1 million. And because inflation is really high right now, it's going to cost us $19.99 now. And now that we're done editing this supply, let's make it active. So you'll see here, we already have this animals payload. Right now it's empty. If we didn't make any mistakes, once we hit save, we should be able to do an update. And on the before update that it fired, you see here that our animals payload field was updated, and it says queued for transfer to JSON server. So now let's go ahead and jump into our JSON server real quick. And right here, it seems like it is not populated. So let's go ahead and see what went wrong. And very quickly, I realized I made a very rookie mistake. You'll see here in our future handler, we have the error message, callout exception, unauthorized endpoint. Basically, I forgot to just add a remote site setting for this thing right here. So no big deal. We can very quickly fix that. To do so, we go into our setup. And again, this is something I probably should have mentioned at the very start, but I forgot. So in our setup, we can search up for remote site settings right here. And I think I already have one for the JSON server, but because I respinned up the ngrok, it gave me a slightly different URL. Thought it was going to be the same one, but it's not. So I have to update it. So let me go ahead and copy that. So right here, we'll copy this and we'll paste the new one right here. We don't have to put the /supplies. We just need the root URL or domain. That's fine. So I'll hit save right here. And now if we go back to our toilet supply record right here, let's go ahead and set this back to like draft or something. And then now if we change it from draft to active, we should note right here the time is going to change by a few seconds or so minutes. So hit save. You'll see here it changed a bit. So now we can go into our database.json, and you'll see here that we now have some output. So it looks like our Apex REST POST Callout is working just fine. Now, one very last thing to note, you'll kind of see here some funky things going on. Like we have the supplies right here, and inside there's like another list. And that's because like this JSON server database module, it's not very sophisticated. It's not gonna like, all it's basically doing is just taking some data from the outside role and then throwing it into this file right here. So that's why you'll see here like there's two lists right here. It's inside two lists. Again, don't worry too much about that. You know, ideally, if you're gonna be doing a post call out to an external endpoint, the endpoint should be able to handle, you know, data coming in, right? Again, this looks funky because this JSON server is very, very simple. It doesn't have much handling behind it. So yeah, don't be dissuaded by this. So yeah, I think going back to our YouTube comment real quick, I think we were able to answer your question on how to make a call out and sending a push request and how to, you know, get that JSON string correct and all that. So yeah, let me know if you guys have any questions. And again, if you guys have any questions about anything else you guys are struggling with, or any video, or you guys want to see me make videos about any other topic in Salesforce or Node or Python or whatever, feel free to let me know down in the comments below. Consider subscribing. I would greatly appreciate it, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.